so happy we alive.
Invited me to participate in a debate he had organized here in Washington on precisely the broad theme that is central to the cases I've been discussing, as well as the war on marijuana and other substances, namely whether the majority's views of morality can ever justify laws that restrict individual freedom. Under Scalia's approach, of course, laws criminalizing marijuana use could continue to be enforced no matter how overwhelming the evidence about marijuana's lack of harm, or even indeed to its positive benefits. So these are the broad philosophical and constitutional issues that are at stake in NORML's essential efforts, with many important practical implications as well for all of us, even beyond those concerning marijuana itself. The ACLU's view, along with John Stuart Mill, is that government may not regulate voluntary conduct by mature individuals just because that conduct offends prevailing notions of morality. And we believe that this view is reflected in American government and law correctly understood. After all, as the Declaration of Independence proclaimed, all men, which I take to include women as well, all people are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. And governments are instituted to secure these rights. In other words, we all have fundamental rights just by virtue of our common humanity. We don't need any government or any laws to give those rights to us. Rather, one of government's highest purposes is to secure our inherent human rights. In short, government's mission is to protect our rights, not to curb them. By the way, since I'm speaking about the Declaration of Independence, I assume you realize that early drafts of the Declaration were written on paper made from that plant that played such an important role in our nation's early history, hemp. In the same vein, I assume you know that marijuana was one of the major painkillers in colonial America. Apparently it was relied on by none other than the founder of our country, the venerated George Washington, to alleviate the painful dental problems that plagued him all his life. Given how important hemp and marijuana were to our founders, I'm sure they would be shocked at our current prohibition. As one historian wrote, by the second half of the 1800s, fluid extracts of hemp were marketed by Parke Davis, Squibb, Lilly, and Burroughs. Another company manufactured cannabis cigarettes as an asthma relief. All these products were sold at modest prices without a prescription at neighborhood pharmacies. Those were the days when drugstores were drug stores, the good old days. Not only would America's founding generations be shocked at our current criminalization as a practical matter, depriving them of access to a plant that was widely used, including for medicinal and recreational purposes, they would also be shocked at the corruption and distortion and discrimination that brought about this policy, not any legitimate concern with public health and welfare. In preparing for this talk, I reviewed the history of our marijuana criminalization in 1937, and once again was shocked at the blatant violations not only of individual rights, but also of the democratic process. After all, it's bad enough if majoritarian preferences are allowed to ride roughshod over individual rights, as I've explained. But worse yet, if the policy in question isn't even supported by a majority, but rather is instigated by a few powerful, fanatical individuals acting to further only their own prejudices or their own economic self-interest. And that was certainly the sordid story behind the criminalization and prohibition of marijuana, as many of you probably know. Fueled by everything from William Randolph Hearst's introduction of the Mexican term marijuana for what had commonly been called to that point hemp or cannabis. He was preying on ethnic prejudices very deliberately. To Hearst and the DuPont Corporation vilifying hemp at a time when their own economic interests depended on paper being manufactured from wood pulp instead of hemp. To government officials lying that the American Medical Association supported outlawing marijuana when the AMA had in fact, strongly opposed that policy, only to change its position 2 years later after the Federal Bureau of Narcotics had punished the AMA for its opposition to prohibition by bringing thousands of prosecutions against doctors for allegedly prescribing narcotics for illegal purposes. So the story of how marijuana was transformed from a respected plant to a reviled weed is certainly shocking in terms of the unethical tactics that led to this criminalization. But our country's founders would no doubt be at least as shocked at our current criminalization as a matter of principle, a dramatic example of government using its power not to protect our unalienable rights, but to the contrary, to usurp them. Prohibition thus violates the view of the relationship between individual liberty and government power that was reflected in the Declaration of Independence and also repeated in the preamble to the Constitution. Listing the purposes of our government, the preamble stresses that one of these is to secure the blessings of liberty. Again, not to provide liberty or to grant it, but rather to secure or ensure our pre-existing, inherent, unalienable human rights. Accordingly, our Constitution does not create a purely democratic or majoritarian form of government. To be sure, of course, most policy decisions are made by public officials who represent the majority of the community, but individual rights are protected against what James Madison called tyranny by the majority. Madison and the other framers recognized that there are some rights that are so fundamental that no majority, no matter how large, can take them away from any minority, no matter how small and unpopular. And of course, the Bill of Rights was added to the Constitution to provide further protection for individual rights against potential majoritarian tyranny. As the ACLU is fond of saying, in the U.S., it should be safe to be different and easy to be free. Alas, though, as the ACLU is also fond of saying, quoting Thomas Jefferson, eternal vigilance is the price of liberty. And certainly our nation's drug laws are a major example of how the rights that should be ours in theory are constantly denied to us in reality. So we have to maintain not only our eternal vigil or watch, but also we must constantly fight to make actual law, actual policy match our nation's founding ideals. Another one of my heroes and another great champion of individual liberties in American history echoed these ideas expressly concerning prohibition laws, the type of laws that now outlaw marijuana and other substances. I'm talking about no less an all-American hero than Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln broadly denounced all prohibition policies as antithetical to liberty and justice. His general condemnation applies specifically to the current marijuana laws and the whole war on drugs. He said, prohibition goes beyond the bounds of reason in that it attempts to control a man's appetite by legislation and makes a crime out of things that are not crimes. A prohibition law strikes a blow at the very principles upon which our government was founded. As you can see then, from Jefferson and Madison through Mill and Lincoln, there is a common philosophical and constitutional vision that is dramatically violated by not only the whole war on drugs, but also by so many other current measures. One of the ACLU's national board members captured this very same vision in very memorable graphic terms a few years ago. We were discussing about whether to reaffirm our longstanding opposition to drug prohibition, specifically in the context of the then new crack epidemic. One board member had asked for a reconsideration of this position in light of evidence about the supposedly unique harms of crack. However, the ACLU's principled opposition to prohibition, consistent with Mill and Lincoln, is that our government may not act in a paternalistic manner to protect mature individuals, even if their personal choices are harmful to themselves. That's their business, not the government's. After all, we defend the rights of individuals to choose voluntarily to commit suicide, with or without a doctor's help. So if some individuals choose to kill themselves relatively slowly, that's also their right. And they can do